Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the ESO Cast, your Elder Scrolls Online podcast. It is Friday, February the 8th. My name is Dennis Force Duhamel. I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Jesse Cox. Hello, Jesse. Welcome back.
Oh, stop it, you. Hello, everybody.
Esteemed, you don't like the word?
It's too much, let's be honest. We both know it is.
All right, so we are here once again with some more Elder Scrolls Online discussion. This week we'll primarily be talking about crafting, realistic visuals, and the game, and then first-person view. But before we do any of that, let's go ahead and go into some news discussion, first of which I'd like to actually take a look at the developer question of the week, something that I've avoided talking about on the cast in the past, just because I personally haven't thought that they were too interesting. But this week's developer question of the week I did think was pretty interesting, and they're actually talking about the one of the Dwemer races and sort of what happened to them. So I'm just going to pause for a quick moment. We're going to play the question of the week, and then Jesse and I will talk about it and give our opinions. Let's go ahead and check that out right now.
Hi, my name is Michael Zanke, and I'm a writer on the Elder Scrolls Online. The mysterious Dwemer race disappeared even before our game began. Nobody in Tamriel knows why, or at least nobody's talking. Knowing what you know about the race, why do you think they disappeared?
So, the Dwemer race, which maybe it's just me, but I always call them the Dwemer. But the Dwemer race...
I thought they were the Dwemer, but it doesn't...
Whatever.
Look, it's one of those things that doesn't even matter, right?
Exactly. Except to the super hardcore who are raging in the comments right now. But the Dwemer race, they're talking about sort of those ancient caves and catacombs that in prior Elder Scrolls games we are always going into and finding amazing loot. And where are they? Where are the actual people who built this, and sort of what has happened to them? Now, as he mentioned, no one in Tamriel knows. We don't have any sort of concrete evidence. But what do we think, if we had to hypothesize, what do we think happened to them? Do you have any ideas whatsoever, Jesse?
Well, I think this video is teasing the fact that in this game we're going to at least find out something about them.
I'll be interested to see if they're actually like there in the game and we see their disappearance at some point in the MMO or their vanishing.
I think according to the lore, they're still long gone by the time this point. Because in the lore, there's the Dwemer, and then I think it's the Chimer, who are the two like elven races. One of the things that people need to remember is that the Dwemer are not dwarves. Just because they live in mountains and underground doesn't make them dwarves. They are elves, just like the Chimer, which are like the descendants of the above ground elves, I guess. I think the dark elves specifically, but I don't. I remember reading it in a book in like one of the games a long time ago, so bear with me on this. My lore may be sketchy. But so basically, while the Chimer became all the elves we know, like over time, over the centuries, millennia, I guess, they became the elves we know. But the Dwemer just up and disappeared. And so no one really knows what happens to them. They were just an underground race of elves who were tinkerers and engineers, and they built vast dungeons all over the world. And then one day they just sort of vanished. And I think that's the big thing no one really knows, and that is the single most perfect way of adding a new race to a game like this, especially an MMO, because it allows for just ridiculous amounts of exploration and things like that. But what I will say, some things that I thought were cool, I do remember specifically reading, and it's a shame that they don't really, you never really know what happens, but everyone knows those, like the spiders and the
all those little mechanical things.
The golems. Yeah, all those things. In one of the books, it was a research journal, and I wish I could remember which game this was, but it said, and this always fascinated me because I never quite got it, but when people at one point in time, because there's all those robots or mechanical, whatever they are, in their dungeons, and I remember asking once, like, why hasn't anyone ever tried to pool or take one of those and use them as weapons and reprogram them or whatever? And it turns out that, in fact, they did. At one point in the lore of the Elder Scrolls franchise, people tried to take the Dwemer mechanized machines out of the old temples and things like that. And after a while, they slowly lost their power and just died down. So they were like unusable. So a scientist took one back, put it in the temple, and it just reactivated. Which means that there's then something in the dungeons that keeps them going. So there's a whole like thing there that is perfect for an MMO because there's so much to work off of, and because no one knows what happened to them, you can literally make that story anything, which I think is really cool.
Do you have any like hypothesis? I'm thinking that, you know, just a sort of a really basic thing without diving much into the lore. They probably were just, you know, they were playing around with some of these ancient artifacts and something went awry and all of a sudden they disappeared. Or maybe I don't know. I think one of the coolest things about it is when you have something like this that's so steeped in mystery, it's almost better to not know. It's one of those.
You're right.
It's one of those things like just any sort of story. You know, it's the mystery leading up to the conclusion that is the most exciting part. And a lot of times, once you get to the conclusion, it's like, oh well, that was a letdown. like the end of Mass Effect 3 is a great example. Like all these things, you've got all this buildup, which is the really cool stuff. But once you find out, it's sort of like, eh. So I sort of hope we don't actually ever know what happened to them, or we don't get a final conclusion at the very least, but just lots of like tips and hints. And I think that would be sort of more exciting.
If I had my druthers, I would do it the same way WoW did the Titan Old God storyline, in which literally over the course of 4 expansions, they told that story. So it wasn't something where one dungeon solved it all. It was, you got a little bit here, and then the next game they give you a little bit more, and they start talking about like the world's creation and get a little bit more and why things are like this and why you know, the curse of flesh and things. They did a really solid job with that. I will give the writing team there all the credit, because that was something where if you were in what is that? What is that?
All right, so for reference,
okay, yeah, that is not a dwarf. That is or a Dwemer. That's a Dwemer, yes.
So I'm playing a video that we found on YouTube that just is sort of going over the history of the Dwemer, and that MS Paint drawing was the greatest.
Right. Well, I'm glad that is. People can verify that I am correct. Then that the Dwemer are not happy little dwarves; they are elves.
Yeah.
And so those are all their creations from Skyrim.
God.
And so, as you can see, those are things that, like, I don't know. There's so much to work with there. I really, really want them to make that story fleshed out, but not something that you can solve in one game. Like, if we get an answer to what the Dwemer are at the end of this one, that better be their main story focus, even though I know it's not, because you have the whole Malik Ball thing.
Right.
So, who knows? I hope that's like an underarching theme throughout the entire game. That'd be exciting.
Right, and again, just to give credit where credit's due, this is coming from the video, the Elder Scrolls lore, the Dwemer and Chimere Part 1, and sort of discussing some of that stuff. So maybe this would help answer some of those questions, or at least put some hypothesis out there in terms of what happened. But it's definitely pretty interesting, and whether or not they do decide to actually answer that question, obviously, I guess we'll find out when the MMO comes out. But I would assume that we're not going to get a solid answer. I cannot get over that picture. That was.
There's a lot of people in chat who were saying that maybe the robots took over. That's interesting, but
an AI takeover. Yeah,
but I think the lore says that it was similar to the Roanoke colony. I don't know if anyone knows that story of. Is it Roanoke? It was one of the first American colonies, and they sent over people, and they established this colony here in the Americas when it was, you know, America was first being settled, and a group leaves to go back to England. They come back, and everyone in the colony is gone, but it's like they food was still in the oven, like it was being prepared still, and there was like tables that looked like they had just been set, things like that. So they just, like, everyone in the colony just up and disappeared in moments, and there was no sign of struggle or no violence, because they thought it might have been like an Indian raid, but things like that.
Right.
So it's this lost colony.
Sounds like an episode of CSI. to be honest.
Right? And so I think that's the same thing here. Like, these people, there was no sign of, like, a revolt or a struggle. They just, like, decided one day everyone just disappeared. And I think that's where the mystery comes from. And that's a really cool concept.
And you have to assume it'd be something, if we were trying to like relate this to modern day standards or whatever, and a similar type situation, if they didn't take all of their belongings, which obviously they didn't, all these treasures are left behind in these mines and these places that we discover that were prior in the past inhabited by the Dwemer. The fact that they didn't take their valuables makes you assume that, is there something mystical and magical going on here, otherworldly, that they all just ended up vanishing? You would assume if they had someplace important to go and didn't want to tell anyone, they would take their stuff, right? But I don't know. It's an interesting, again, it's an interesting mystery.
It's also the fact that people in chat are saying that there's blood and stuff is ripped and torn in the temples and things like that in the dungeons. But keep in mind, it's been several thousand years since they've been around, and people have taken them over. People have inhabited them.
Yeah, there's bandits in them all the time. So you have to assume. I would assume the blood and stuff would be more of them.
It's not. Yeah, it's not theirs.
Unless they have eternal blood that never dries up or something. I don't know. All right,
who knows?
It's an interesting question, and again, I think the mystery is the coolest part of it. But let's move on. Let's move on to discussion of player housing and the fact that, unfortunately, at launch, it will not exist in the Elder Scrolls Online. This is going to be something that's quite thematic here on the podcast, the discussion of the removal of something from the single-player game for the sake of an MMO, and this is a perfect example of one of them. Last week, there was a tweet that went out saying, won't have player housing at release, but it's a feature we may consider in the future. And I have to be perfectly honest, whenever I see this is a feature we may consider in the future,
it's never going to happen.
Exactly. That's basically my assumption there. So let's talk a little bit about player housing. I think player housing is such a cool concept, and I'm sure that there are games in the past that have done it so successfully. But some of the games that I've looked most forward to having player housing in, it just sort of never happened, or it never happened the way I envisioned it. I can't recall what game, but I remember seeing somewhere, someone was telling me about this MMO where they legitimately have player-constructed houses that they build, and they create this city, and the more houses that are built, the larger the city grows. And that in concept is something that I've always thought would be really phenomenal to have in a video game. Although you have to think about like real estate, and I'm not talking about like who's going to buy and sell the houses, but more so the amount of available space for something like that. I think actually constructing houses would be really difficult in a large scale in a big game. But having something like an instanced house, for example, I think that could work really well. And it's well, I don't know. Go ahead.
There's two things there that we need to consider. One, instance housing always ends up being something that, well, it's cool for you as a developer. I mean, I can see why that'd be a pain in the ass to do, because no one can see it but you. So You're creating this thing for a single person. So I guess it would kind of be like Final Fantasy XI. They did that pretty well, but the whole point of having housing was to show it off, and so people just take screenshots, and it was, and then a whole industry like woodworking was designed after it, and then people would create stuff to go, that kind of thing. It was a cool concept, but the amount of time that went into it, I don't think that a lot of developers want to waste that time. With that said, then, the idea of having towns that you can build and a world that you can create is kind of like Star Wars Galaxies, I would think, where you could make your own towns, make your own cities. The problem is in that game, the cities looked awesome, and you could build forts in them, and you could have like Imperial walkers patrolling the town and stuff. It was really cool. But eventually, because people still want to do the actual game, the towns became like ghost towns. And so there's entire swaths of land filled with houses that no one was there, and it was real weird and real creepy. And I think they also want to try and avoid stuff like that. So there's a lot of things to consider here, but mostly on the developer side. So I have a feeling that when someone says we're not going to include it, it's not because they hate you, it's because there's a lot of work that might not be worth the investment at a launch. And so that's why a lot of people don't do it. I will still say, my idea of you being able to put your stuff in a fort you take over because the fort already exists is a really good idea.
It is. I think that's a really cool idea for the PvP aspect to have that frontal line moving. But let's just go back. Let's just go back to the discussion of like the towns and the player housing. So, for example, you said Star Wars Galaxies had a similar system where you could construct this house and cities were built, but there was no incentive for people to be there, so there were ghost towns. So, if they were to do something along those lines, we would have to think now what would an incentive be? Like, how could they create incentive for people to be in these areas? I know personally for me, when I'm playing a game of this scale, an MMO, I am mostly going to be at a central location to the things that are important to me. So PvP zones or raid dungeons, whatever provides easy access to that. Take my experience with WoW, for example. I was always Hearthstone to the town that was central to everything I was doing at the time. So they would need something, without being too specific, they would need to create a similar incentive if they were to have a player-constructed town with houses, wherever that area was, that is where you need to be. Which goes back to Jesse's idea of being on the front lines of PvP. Like that's it's sort of reinforcing the concept that this is a great idea, because for anyone who is PvPing, obviously this doesn't apply for people who just want to do the PvE stuff, but for anyone who is PvPing, if the housing was there, the guild housing, player housing, whatever you want to call it, there would always be a reason to be there, because that's where you want to be in terms of gameplay and what you're actually doing. So I don't know if you agree with that sentiment or not, Jesse, but
I thought up the idea.
Well, I just mean the idea of how can they incentivize player housing so that people are actually there? Do you have any?
Oh, well, I mean, incentivizing they'd have to create a system that was similar to, I think, what Final Fantasy XIV tried to do, where you don't have to be like mage, or you can be a farmer, or you can be like maybe develop a subclass, like maybe that's an expansion where now you can live in the world. And so there are farmers, and there's fishermen, and there's
woodworkers who can
craftsmen,
fix up your housing as it's damaged
things like
from
that.
Weather.
Yeah, and so people would do that as well, and that's another way to level up. And so then certain things give you, like woodworking means that you can, like, you get tougher hands. I don't know what the hell that would do for you, but it's things like that, or certain things would be incorporated into it.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
That's the only way I can think of.
Yeah,
give
and
people a reason to be there. Yeah.
I guess the other thing too, so aside from the concept of having this player constructed housing and trying to incentivize people to be there so that it's not a ghost town, the other flip side is the idea of instance housing. But I guess as Jesse mentioned, you run into a situation where besides yourself or maybe your group members, no one's ever going to see that. So sort of what's the point besides posting up pictures and throwing them on Reddit or some, community site forums or something like that.
Yeah.
Which, truthfully, who's going to really care? Most people aren't going to care. Unless you do something super inventive or creepy inside of your house, then I don't think anyone's really going to be too concerned with it. But, I don't know, to give the idea of having your home is sort of neat. It's, either way, it's not going to be there, or at least maybe it's something that we'll see in the future. But that is that when it comes to player housing in Elder Scrolls Online.
And that's something that has really been a popular addition in previous Elder Scrolls games, so I would hope that they would at least consider it in the future.
Yeah, I mean, Bethesda again, this is not being developed by Bethesda, but Bethesda even released an entire expansion, the Hearthfire expansion for Skyrim, dedicated to house building and orphaning children and stuff like that. So it's obviously a major thing if there's an expansion dedicated to it. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It will be interesting to see if they decide to do that. But for now, no housing. No housing. We're all hobos here in ESO. No place to live. All right, Facebook pages likes. The Elder Scrolls Online this is actually something that I thought was really interesting. And talking with some of the community team at ZeniMax, they said, hey, maybe you should bring this up. And I agreed. They're actually getting close to hitting 1 million likes on the Elder Scrolls Online Facebook page.
Nice.
Now, the reason I think this is important and worthwhile of discussion is that's actually a fairly significant number. And just for a point of reference, the World of Warcraft Facebook page has 4.6 million likes, and the Diablo Facebook page has 2.4 million likes. Now, this is all without any, as far as I know, there has been no promotion from ZeniMax that says, like our page for X reason. You know, a lot of games will do like our page, you got a chance to get into the beta. Like our page, and after so many likes, we'll release information on the game or something like that. That's something that they did with the Diablo campaign. But without any sort of baiting for likes like that, the fact that they already have close to 1 million likes is pretty big. And people might say, like, who cares? It's Facebook. Well, you know, Facebook is obviously, this is like the modern day way a lot of people communicate. It's one of the biggest social networking things nowadays. And the fact that so many people within the Facebook atmosphere have liked this page shows that there's some fairly significant interest in this game. And I don't know. It is really exciting to me because it makes me believe that if they, before the beta, already have close to 1 million likes, I feel like they could hit close to 2 million likes. And if you compare that to like the Diablo's 2.4 million likes, I mean, that's you look at like sale numbers, and obviously there's no direct correlation, but just the fact that there's a lot of interest there is I guess why I wanted to bring it up.
I think the number is good. Having 1 million people interested in your game is very solid for people who are developing it because they know sort of what the expectations are. Mm-hmm. But I also think that we need to keep in mind that comparing it to, say, Star Wars or Diablo or things like that, those are games that got a lot of likes too and followers, but didn't turn out too well.
Yeah.
So the comparison to other things may not be the best that we can do, but the sentiment of them hitting 1 million is going to be pretty great.
Right, yeah. And
that shows people care and they're interested in the game.
Exactly. I guess that was the whole point, and that's why I wanted to bring it up, because it does show that there is interest and people are excited about the game and looking forward to it. Now, how the game actually turns out, how that eventually relates to sales or whatever, there's obviously no way to tell, but yes, there is interest in the game, and that's obviously good to know. So there you go. Next up in news, we'll be talking about an article on MMORPG.com. This isn't anything new directly from the developer, but in the article, based on prior discussions, they're talking about basically crafting within the game. So if you happen to miss it, in last week's podcast, we were discussing how crafting is going to play a major role in the Elder Scrolls Online, so much so that some of the high-end gear, or at least equivalent to the high-end gear available in the game, can be acquired through crafting. Now, something they also talked about is sort of how the crafting system is going to work, and that what they're trying to do, what their goal is to have it so that players have to work together in order to acquire crafting materials. So, for example, you're going to need, for a lot of the better recipes, you're going to need materials from all across the continent, all across the world within the game. So I'm interested to know a couple of things. I'm interested to know if this will be cross-faction based, and how acquiring these materials will take place. Now, one thing that I personally don't like, but this is only because of my interest as a gamer in an MMO, I personally don't like a crafting system that requires crafting materials from dungeons. Because frankly, I'm not a big fan of raids. I'm not a big fan of that experience of gathering people together and then dumping hours and hours of trial and error into this thing. Like, I understand PvE progression is huge for a lot of people, but it's just not where my interest lies. So me personally, I'm sort of hoping that a crafting system does not require materials from in dungeons, but I'm at the same time assuming that will be the case. I would more like to see something that we've got rare materials scattered throughout the world that are going to be difficult to acquire, just for sake of argument. Just say there's a low drop percentage, and you have to, you can't farm everything yourself, so you're going to need to sort of trade and barter with other people in order to get these things. But yeah, it's I don't know, it's a pretty interesting idea, and I'll be, again, really interested to see if they try to pull things in, or what sort of things they pull in from other games. Now, Jesse, are you much of a crafter? Is crafting anything you've ever really dived into much in any game?
Well, one of the things that I mean, yes, I have, but I think the big concern I have is how much time you need to invest in it. Because once it gets to the point where you have to invest a lot of time, that's when I'm like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. Good examples are in WoW. Crafting for me became, I guess, really, I don't even know. It was like you needed to craft, but the result was pointless. Like, you would craft, you spend all the time crafting, but then the stuff at the end of the game was useless for you, right? And then in Guild Wars, the crafting was intricate and detailed and fun. You needed this to craft this, this, and this, and this, and all sorts of things. And then, of course, at the end, it becomes super complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still kind of worth it. So I'm hoping that a fine line is established in the middle there. Sorry, I was rambling while I was trying to fix my sound there for you guys.
Oh, I just noticed you got quieter. People yelling at you for your mic.
People always yell at me. I'm used to it.
Stop inhaling your mic, Jesse. I don't know. It's again, the crafting system. I personally, again, do hope that they're not going to be pulling from dungeons and stuff, but I also feel like that is going to be the case. And there's all sorts of ideas on the table. I was taking a look at the Reddit post talking about this, and people were saying that they hope that crafters get some sort of a benefit, like maybe extra armor slots or things like that, or extra stats, and trying to make crafting a legitimate trade that people can really, really focus on, because I feel like in a lot of games it's just this sort of side menial task that you do in order to get certain pieces of gear, especially if the gear is going to be really good. Then people are going to want to do it in one way or the other. But to make it less of this extra thing that you have to do and more of something that people can devote a lot of time to and really, really focus on, which would be cool for the people who enjoy crafting and want to make that sort of their primary focus in playing the game.
I just think it needs to be worth it. One of the things, I actually sat down with the developers of WoW a while ago, and I straight out asked them, like, this is one of the biggest problems I have with your game. You have a crafting system that from level 1 to 60 back in the original release was a useful thing, and the items you can make were good at endgame. And over time, you've made it so the only way to get good items is through raids at the end of the game. If you're a raider and you're trying to use crafting gear, you are mocked and ridiculed because it is the dumbest way to play. Like, it's pointless. Crafting gear is a useless thing in WoW. And so I was simply saying that, what are you going to change this ever? And they got really offended with the fact that I thought that their crafting system was garbage. And so I'm like, ever since then, I'm really staunch about this fact that I believe firmly that if you have a crafting system in your game, it needs to be useful at all levels. And rather than go into a deep dungeon and get some loot there, you should be able to craft, going on a quest to collect all the different parts of it, the exact same, not item, but tier of gear through crafting. And so you can either spend 3 hours in a raid with a whole group, or you can go by yourself and collect items and farm stuff. Maybe it takes 3 hours or 5 hours because all you're doing is really farming. But whatever the case may be, you should be able to get the equivalent of that. And that's something that WoW has gone away from. Elder Scrolls doesn't really offer that, but there is a certain way you can do that. I mean, it's just, why have crafting if the stuff you craft is garbage?
Yeah, and I like your idea, have some sort of equivalent if it's not exactly the same, either by solo means instead of group means for people who just like to go that route. And I think it's going to be especially important in this game, since this game is, obviously pulling from the Elder Scrolls series, which has been a single-player focused thing up until this point. So to have that option for people who sort of want to do their own thing, but still have strong enough or equivalent gear, I think that would be really great. And I guess you make a good point. You look at something like raiding, it's inherently more difficult because you have to deal with other people. So if you're going to have this requirement of raiding this 3-4 hour dungeon with multiple people and trying to coordinate together to get X materials, well, then maybe you should have to grind, if you're doing it solo, just a little bit longer to get X materials, because it's easier because you're doing it by yourself and you're not having to coordinate and line up raid times and stuff like that. And I think that would be a fair trade-off to at least have the option there for people through various means.
Right. Give them the ability to make something of equivalent value. And it might not look as cool, it might not, but give it the ability to actually be as cool.
Yeah,
have the abilities, or stats.
Yep, yeah, I agree. All right, now let's go ahead and move into our first major discussion point for today, which we'll be talking about first-person view in the Elder Scrolls Online. The reason this is coming up right now, this is actually being pulled from... Did I miss something?
Nothing. It's mostly because of me, because I suck.
No. Oh no! Yeah, right. So the reason this is being brought up is there was an article that we actually discussed last week. It was a Penny Arcade editorial talking about the Elder Scrolls Online. And if you remember from last week, what we talked about was the notion of being able to make your character feel like a hero among a sea of heroes. There was a little tidbit from that article that we didn't actually bring up last week, but I wanted to discuss this week because it seems to be rearing its ugly head within the Elder Scrolls community on Reddit forums and different posts and videos that are being made as well. This is the whole notion of first-person view in the Elder Scrolls Online. And from the article, here's a direct quote here from Matt. What?
Nothing. Sorry.
I thought you were screaming at me.
No.
A direct quote from Matt Fyroar that says gameplay changes. All right. So he says previously single-player experience to an MMO, making that transition can be tricky, and there are concessions that have to be made. And one of them that he mentions is that some of the gameplay changes have to be made. You can move the camera to first person in ESO, but you won't see your hands or weapons as in previous games. And the realistic visuals have been dropped, which is the second part we'll be talking about after. But first, I'd like to focus on the whole idea of first person view not being the way that it is in prior Elder Scroll games. Now, Jesse, of course, had experience with the Elder Scrolls Online, and he got a chance to play it. Was it late last year? It was like in the fall last year, right?
Yeah.
So he got a chance to play it. Do you remember much at all about the first-person view in the game? I mean, they're saying that you can't see your weapons or hands, so...
Well, I mean... I think at the time I'd stated that you can go first-person view, like Skyrim or whatever I'd said, and I was referring to the fact that you could go into first-person view like those games if you want to play like it, but I do not remember if you saw your arms or not. I'm gonna go on a limb and say if they're saying you didn't, then I didn't, and I just assumed that was the case because I don't remember, honestly.
Yeah, I think some of the confusion was people were thinking that because you said the combat was like Skyrim, they thought you meant pinpoint exactly like it. I'm assuming that it was never there. The first-person animations were never there, and that's just how it is now as well. Not that they sort of like retroactively decided to take it out. But I'd like to. What's most important is I'd like to talk about why this is the case. There's a lot of people who are saying, you know, there's other games that do it, and they do it in the Elder Scrolls single-player games. They've got first-person view, and you can also pull back to third-person. Now, not being a developer myself, this is how I understand it. This is how I understand it to work, or maybe to be more precise, why it doesn't work or why it's not going to happen in the Elder Scrolls Online. So you've got the single-player Elder Scroll games, and the primary focus is first-person view. So we have animations for your character dedicated to how they look in first-person view. You've got your shield that you can lift up, you swing your sword and your arm pulls back and then it drops forward, or you pull your bow back and you've got that specific animation. Now, you take that animation for your character whenever you do something like an attack or cast a spell, and if you pull your camera back to third person, it is the exact same animation. You're just seeing it from the top down. The reason I think it's different is because the inherent nature of an MMO, the fact that the primary focus of this game, whether you like it or not, which you probably don't if you're a hardcore Elder Scrolls fan, the nature of this game is to be played in the third person. In an Elder Scroll, in an MMO, situational awareness, being able to see behind you and around your character is very important, especially for PvE and PvP. Right. You need to know what the heck's going on. You can't just see in the cone directly in front of you, even if you pull the frame of view all the way back or whatever, the field of view. It's not enough. It's not enough vision. So the animations are designed specifically with third person in mind. I mean, think about as simple as this. Think about how you cast a spell in Skyrim. No matter what spell you cast, it's like you raise your hand and a different particle effect comes out. They're not going to do that with a third person focus. When you cast spells in this game, there's going to be a wind-up, and you can take a look at gameplay footage already out there. Anytime there's cast spells, there's this whole wind-up animation. Your character will like swing his arms around, depending on what spell it is. He'll cast a fireball, he'll shoot out his hands. But in Skyrim, you're literally you're putting your hand up in the air, and like particles are moving around, or you're like sticking your hands directly in front of you. But that's basically it for animations. That would look completely shitty in a game that's focused on third-person perspective, which, again, because it's an MMO, that's how it is. So that's my opinion in terms of why they're focusing on the third-person animation because of just the inherent nature of the game and needing to be able to see around you.
Well, I think that even though it would be difficult, I think that they should invest the time in trying to figure out how to make it work. Because one of the things that they said, and they keep saying this, that they want this to be a middle ground between MMOs and the Elder Scrolls franchise, and make this the Elder Scrolls Online. So it's not Elder Scrolls the MMORPG, it's Elder Scrolls with your friends. Like,
right.
That's what they want it to be.
Yeah.
And I think the more they give into concessions like this, the more it's going to that MMO side. And I think that they deeply didn't want it to be that. And so, just being the picky person that I am, I'm going to remind them that this is something that would go a long way into helping move it back the other way and getting those Elder Scrolls fans back into it and want to play the game, because they're going to get a lot of pushback on that.
Yeah, and there is already a lot of pushback. In fact, one of the reasons we're talking about this today is because there was a video post from ESO Cast, and they do sort of weekly Elder Scrolls discussion, and they were talking about the lack of first-person view from this article that we just referenced, and sort of why it was. And in their video, they talk about like the developers being lazy and not wanting to do it, and all sorts of things. I'm not going to say I'm chalking it up to laziness. It's hard to say they're not working hard, because I guarantee you they're busting their ass for 12, 14 hours a day. But what I will say is this probably has a lot more to do with time and money. Now, again, as we just talked about, the animation focus is in third person because of the need to see around you in an MMO, because you're playing with other people. When you're playing by yourself, if you don't know what's going on around you and you just keep getting stabbed in the back, that's your problem. But when you're playing with other people, I think there's just this whole social dynamic where it becomes a lot more of an issue. So if they were to want to have animations set for first person view, they would have to basically make 2 sets of animations for every attack, every spell, every movement within the game. There would need to be a first-person view animation created and a third-person view. And not that they can't do that, but it's about time and resources. Like, sure, they can add a first-person perspective. If you really want that, this game's probably coming out in 2016. I mean, that's just sort of like a realistic, as far as I'm concerned, based on what they've said, like, you know?
And I understand that. I think that's something that they need to look at what they have on their hands. What they have is an Elder Scrolls game, and if they want it to continue to be an Elder Scrolls game, they have to cater to the Elder Scrolls fan base, which is something I know they want to do and they're actively trying to do. And if they're looking for ways to throw them a bone, this is one of them. I mean, it's something that would go a long way with them. And that's their core fan base. I mean, the built-in fan base of this game is the people who have played the previous games. Very few people are coming into this game saying, who haven't played an Elder Scrolls game, who are coming in going, oh, well, I'm interested in this. Because they don't know anything about it. So if you haven't played an Elder Scrolls game, you see this, and to you see elves and humans and monsters, and you're like, yeah, just another MMO, right?
Right.
It's the setting and the world and that kind of thing that has people interested because they love that franchise. So the key is, how do you balance that line between MMO and creating something that fits in that franchise? And they know how to do it. The question is, do they have the will to actually do it?
Yeah, and I'm not even saying, I've been really kind of pushing why this is happening. As far as once again, I'm not a developer, but as far as I understand why it's happening. But I'm not saying that they shouldn't include a first-person view. I completely agree with Jesse. If they want to remain true to the hardcore Elder Scroll fan base, which is, let's be honest, that's where all the hype behind this game is coming. People aren't hyped for this game because it's being developed by ZeniMax Online Studios. ZeniMax Online Studios hasn't done anything in the past. I mean, the individuals within the company have worked on prior games, but the studio itself has not done anything yet. So people are excited because of the Elder Scrolls name. And you're absolutely right that if they want to stay true to that Elder Scrolls fan base, first person is well, that's how people primarily played the game. I personally spent a lot of time in third person. I think because of my my gaming history and MMOs, that the idea of wanting to see what's around me being so important, I have played primarily in third person for that reason. But a majority, I'm an anomaly there. A majority of people play this series in first person view. So, and again, that's where all the hype's coming from. So to not stay true to that decision alone could really backfire for them, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I play MMOs the way you do. I pull my camera back as far as humanly possible.
I get mods, if possible, to pull it back further in some games even.
To figure out where everything is and what's going on and get a whole overview of the entire area. That's what I do in MMOs. But people play games differently, and a lot of people want to play an Elder Scrolls game like an Elder Scrolls game, and everyone has different play styles. Like, in driving games, for example, people have many different ways they play driving games. For me, I play where you don't even see the car, like where you're at like the very nose of the car, that camera view, and it's just the screen. I do really well like that. If you put me in the car and have stuff around me, it's impossible for me to drive. I suck at it. And so it's that kind of thing that people have different play styles. But unfortunately for the developers here, ZeniMax, they have a game that one of the major play styles was being in first person. And so to transition the millions of people who have played an Elder Scrolls game from that first person view to an MMO view is going to be a difficult task. I mean, and I guess it can be done, but I don't know.
Yeah, it is. It is going to be tough. There's no question about that, and it'll be really interesting to see. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. We say a majority. I would say like 99% of people who played Elder Scrolls games played it in first person, and it's because it's a different style of game. The Elder Scrolls games, most people focus on immersion. They're more trying to be involved within the world, sort of role-playing, pretending that they are the character. So many people have backstories in these games and all sorts of things like that. And immersion's the biggest part. Whereas, as we discussed in an MMO, situational awareness is important not only for yourself, but also for the people you're playing with. Because if you don't see what's going on around you, the people you're playing with in a group are going to suffer. Whether that's a PvP situation, seeing people coming up behind you, whether you're in a raid and you need to see where the flame wave is coming at so that you can avoid it. Knowing what's going on around you is super important in those games. And in that sense, they're also much more intense. Whereas Elder Scrolls, Elder Scrolls has never been known for amazing combat. It's been known for an immersive world. But that transition is being made here due to the fact that it's an MMO and they're trying to stick to some of those standards. And yeah, again, it's going to be tough. It's really going to be a tough sell, I think, for a lot of people. And maybe the Elder Scrolls universe and the Elder Scrolls lore will be enough to draw people into this game. But I think it's going to hurt. I really think their exclusion of first-person specific animations is going to hurt them. I don't know. It's tough. It really is. And I'm actually really surprised we didn't talk about this last week. I completely glazed over that in the article. But, dude, I mean, I'm trying to think here. Like, with third-person animations, I assume there is a way that they could just make those limbs show. I guess they can't. If they could easily do that, they would, right? So it must be the case that they would have to make a second set of animations for first-person view, and that would add a ton of resources and a ton of development time, and this game wouldn't be out to 2014 or 15 or whatever,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just one of those things. I think I personally don't care. Like, I'm one of those people. Sure. I just don't care. Yeah. But I know for a fact that the built-in audience is something they deeply care about.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to decide where you draw the line at. And I don't know if this is where they should draw the line.
Yeah, no, you're right. I agree. It's going to be one of those things, again, I feel like I say this all the time, but it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out and how people respond to it. Right now, there's definitely some people up in arms about it, understandably so. We'll see if ZeniMax can pull it off and still have enough things that they can excite people about with this game to draw them in. And then the second part of this, and our final discussion point for today, is going to be the concept of realistic visuals. This is another concession that they've had to make, although I don't think it's been as big, because based on the screenshots and the gameplay footage that I have seen so far, their visuals are pretty spot on. And where you can't, in an MMO, not that you can't, but you don't want to push graphical fidelity crazy high like what you see in Skyrim for the sake of wanting to get it on as many systems as possible to get most people playing it. I think they've made up for in their artistic design and just the way the world has been pieced together. So while the graphical fidelity may not be super high, I think that the art assets that they put together to make Skyrim look like Skyrim, it's done really well. But yeah, having crazy realistic visuals, it's just not realistic in an MMO, because a developer won't do that, because they'll be shooting themselves in the foot. I think Age of Conan tried crazy realistic visuals, and an issue for them was that not a lot of systems could run the game, so they had more problems than that. But that's one of the reasons that game really didn't take off, because the graphics requirement, the barrier of entry, was a bit too high for most people's computers to run.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people are complaining about, that I will take the side of the developers on this one. The graphics look just fine. Having seen the game, they look great. And a lot of people are complaining, like, the characters are a little cartoony, that's just artistic style. The development of the games over the Elder Scrolls franchise series, all the characters look slightly different. Mm-hmm. It's, it's just art style in this game, but the worlds are beautiful. Everything about it looks great. So I can't agree with anyone who's like, they're taking shortcuts on the graphics. No, they're not. That I won't agree with. Yeah. I can complain about a lot of things, but not the way the game looks.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. Again, it's as basic as they want as many people as possible to play it. And while they might not be able to have crazy high fidelity, they can make up for it in assets. And I do think that they've done that very well here. And Jesse, only person probably watching this podcast who has actually played it, says that he agrees. So I'm going to take your word for it, sir. All right, we're going to be wrapping up today, and this is something we're going to try to do every week with some questions from you guys in the community. And where you can ask these questions is right on over on our Facebook page. You can find a link to that right here on top of the YouTube page. There's a link to my Facebook page. And yeah, go ahead and ask questions there, and we'll try to answer them at the end of the cast. So the first question I've got today is from Jassim Al-Madadi, which, forgive me if I mispronounce. He asks, based on Jesse's gameplay of the game, how fluid is the combat, and is there any weight behind it? And I actually really like this question. He wants to know if it feels floaty or if the animations interconnect and you really get that visceral feel of combat. I think this is crucial to games, and weighty combat, non-floaty combat, really is something that makes me stick with a game over the long haul. Your recollection, Jesse, how did the combat feel?
This is probably a horrible question for me to answer, because immediately when I got my character, I figured out that you could equip a weapon in both hands and went dual wield with like daggers, like right off the bat. So my combat was really fast. And I guess when you fight guys that have, like two-handed weapons, they're a little slower to swing. And there are powerful attacks, so if you hold down the right or left mouse button, your attack will be more powerful swing, like it is in Skyrim, for example, right now, where if you click it, you just swing once, but if you hold it down, you do like a hard swing. It's that kind of thing in this game as well. And where you swing depends on where you're facing, so it has everything you need in it to have that first person, by the way, wink, wink, nudge, nudge to what we were talking about earlier. I mean, everything's there. The mechanics are there, and there's dodge mechanics, and so if you fight a guy, he'll have... You can see it in third person, which is why I would do it, but he has like a targeting thing, so I fought a bear, and the bear reared back, and it was going to attack me, but it had to rear back and go raw, and then swing forward, so in that time, you had the time to get out of the way, so things like that. The combat is real fluid in that, but if you're talking about weight, I picked the weapons that were probably the lightest in the game, and so it felt like I had nothing. Yeah. I was just running around and swinging and killing people, and so that might not be the best question for me, but
I mean, it was
hopefully
also an early build of the game, so to getting that real strong connection, that can be something that they sort of work on over time. And the beta should be here soon enough, so I guess we'll be able to more concretely answer that once that begins. All right, next question here is pretty interesting as well. Will ESO be controller compatible, or what do you think it should be? That is a really neat question. I'm going to assume it won't be, but I think because of the system they're going for, because it's such a limited skill set, sort of like way Diablo works. You basically select the skills that you want to use in combat, and those are the ones you'll have access to. With a limited system like that, I think it's potential that they could do that.
I mean, you have 6 options of buttons. You have 5 that are abilities, and then the 6th one that's like a special ability that I guess your class gets. Mm-hmm. Other than that, your screen is those buttons and a minimap, and that's it.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's a lot of potential there that you could use a controller, because you could have an attack button, you could have a jump button, you could have your run button, and then everything else is like you can cycle through your abilities, or you have like ability hot buttons. Like maybe X, I'm looking at my Logitech controller here. Maybe X, Y, B, A are 4 of your abilities, and then you can take 2 of the top ones and make that 5 and 6, and then the triggers are your attack or block, and then your movement things, like if you hold down, you move, you run, things like. I mean, there's a lot of options there, because really, only 6.
Yeah.
I think that works really well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I thought they were going to do with Diablo 3. And release it on consoles, but they never did, which was, I guess, the fault of Diablo 3's. But still, I mean, this is
not yet, at least. Who knows?
Right, but the fact that this is simplified enough at the start, I think there's a lot of potential there that you can use controllers.
Yeah,
that might feel kind of cool. Now, I would never do it because I suck at games where you have to control things and like the X and Y axes. I'm like, why don't you work?
Yeah, I think especially coming from if people obviously could have played some of the Elder Scrolls games on console, so to have that experience again, because I'm pretty sure this isn't planning to come to console. Who knows though? We've got the next gen consoles coming out right around the corner, but unfortunately, not a lot of MMOs sort of do that cross compatibility. I always thought that'd be really cool for a game though, to have not only available on multiple platforms, but also cross-compatible where you're playing with people. I'm sure there's an MMO or 2 out there, and I'm sure people will list them there. But got another question about the user interface. It's really simplistic. As Jesse said, you basically have your skill bar and a mini-map, and that's about it. He asked about modding as well. I
don't think they're going to allow that.
Yeah, I want to say that I heard that is not going to be an option. That modding will not be an option. So
I mean, because when it comes to it, you have... I'm trying to think of all the menus, and there aren't many. I think that's what they're going for. You have a button. I don't know if it was T or if it was the tilde. It was something that gave you... maybe it was Y. Gave you access to your quests. I don't know why it would have been that button, but it was alpha, so what are you going to do? But it let you see your quests, so you could have like a list of quests on your screen. Then there was the overworld map that I think was M if you just press map. Then there was a screen that had your stats for your class, and a screen that had the stats for your character. And then I believe that was it. There might have been a journal system where if you find... Yeah, I know there was, but I don't remember what the button was. But if you find books or things like that, you can make your own library. That was something... But it wasn't like a legit... It was your personal library of finding books and stuff.
Sure.
And so, and that was pretty much it, as far as I can recall, and besides your character screen, but that's maybe like 7 menus, and that's it. So they do not give you like a whole giant thing of like let's just throw screens at them and micromanagement. It's very much focused on the actual world and the gameplay, and again, that comes from the idea of they want it to be very similar to Elder Scrolls franchise, where it isn't about micromanaging various aspects of your character. It's about just enjoying the world.
Yeah.
And so I hope they stay on that path.
Yeah. Absolutely. One final question here. I like this one because it's a major concern that I have. This one's coming from Jordan THD. He says, I hate to beat a dead horse but faction lock issue keeps bothering me. I wish the devs would make a statement about how they're going to restrict Ebonheart pack players from going to Almere Dominion zones, etc. Is it going to be invisible walls, super hard AI guards, or what do you think they're going to do? This is something that really deeply bothers me, and I don't remember if we've gone into it in much depth, but if we haven't yet in a podcast, I think we will in the future. The idea of restricting zones and not letting someone from the Ebonheart pack go into the Almere Dominion zones, it really does bother me for a multitude of reasons. Number one, I don't want to have to re-roll 3 characters to see all 3 zones. And obviously, to get the story of the quest, you'd have to do that, but to just visually, to just like walk around Skyrim, or walk around Daggerfall. Like, I want to be able to do that with whatever character I make on whatever faction. Obviously, I don't belong there. Guards should attack me. Players should be able to kill me. And if you're worried about ganking, just do a system where the only way I can attack anyone is if they attack me first. A flagging system is really simple. Again, not a developer, but in concept, it's really simple to implement. It's been done in the past. And it stops that worry of high-level players ganking low-level players. And even if you're concerned about killing NPCs, make it so they can't kill quest NPCs, only guards or whatever, But just being able to walk around there, I hope, there's been no concrete answer yet, so I can't give Jordan a concrete answer, but I hope that they have some option to do it, even if there's crazy hard guards that you have to fight your way through just to get into the zone or something. Or these towers that shoot laser beams at your face if you go where you're not supposed to be. But I don't know. I don't know if this bothers you, Jesse, but the notion of them like having invisible walls, if that's the case, so that you can't go into those other zones, that would really, it would turn me off. I'd be really upset because, again, I don't want to have to make 2 additional characters to see the other faction zones.
I don't know the specifics of what they're blocking off.
Yeah, they haven't announced, but they have said that players won't be able to go into other faction zones, or that they're not encouraging it.
Well, that might be different than maybe not encouraging it means, hey, there's not going to be anything for you in there.
Yeah.
If you go in there, you're not going to find any quests or any super cool secrets or loot.
Right.
But if you want to go in there, you can explore. Like, maybe that's what they're saying.
Hopefully. That's what I hope.
But I feel like their descriptor of what they're talking about might be a little too vague, because maybe they're referring to only the starting zones. Maybe they're referring to certain aspects of the zones, right? Until we actually have definitive proof, I don't know that we can say that this is a sucky thing. Like, you know me, I'm the first one to complain about some crap, but I don't know that I can complain about something that I'm not sure about yet.
Yeah, and I mean, that's definitely going to be the case until, again, the game goes into beta, or over time as we get more information. But for argument's sakes, if they're considering, invisible walls so that factions can't go into opposing faction areas, I hope they reconsider. If that is, in fact, the way it is, then I hope that has changed or something, because besides making new characters, I just want to be able to explore. If I feel like wasting an hour and walking around Skyrim just to see what it looks like, maybe killing some guards or whatever, I'd love to have that option, rather than re-leveling up a character just to see that stuff. But that's my personal opinion, so take it for what it is. All right, and I guess with that, we're going to wrap up this week's episode of the ESO Cast, your Elder Scrolls Online podcast. Thank you guys so much for watching and listening. And we'll, of course, be back next week, hopefully with some more information. Hopefully, there wasn't really a lot of new stuff from ZeniMax this week, but if we get some more stuff next week, it'll be really good. So, all right, that's going to do it. Thanks, guys, so much. Once again, this has been Dennis Force Duhamel, joined by Jesse Cox, and we will see you next time.
See ya!